When Resident Evil 2 came out in January 1998, it was met with critical and commercial success. Capcom made a sequel that one-upped the original in every possible way, and speaking personally, it's up there as one of my favorite games in the series. It's a classic. There was a lot of hype, anticipation, and build-up towards the release, though when it came out, some fans were left a little puzzled. You see, for months the screenshots and prints from magazine articles presented a different-looking game than what came out, and for years people were left wondering what happened to that game, a game that would become known as Resident Evil 1.5. It was the holy grail for Resident Evil fans. Hello and welcome back to Deep Cuts, a show that examines lore, backstories, and theories in video games. People want what they can't have. It's human nature. We can't help it. Video game fans, collectors, enthusiasts, they're no different. It's why rare or hard to find games are so sought after, oftentimes regardless of the quality of the game. Like, the Wii had tons of shovelware, but collectors are now paying big money for the harder to find titles. It may not make sense to me or you, but one man's trash is another man's treasure. I won't judge. And it doesn't get any more rare than a game that was never released. The Resident Evil 2 that fans know and love actually came together after the original project was scrapped and started over. Work on the follow-up to the original Resident Evil began shortly after the game's completion in 1996. And by early 1997, when about 60 to 80% of Resident Evil 2 was complete, the team had made the difficult decision to start the game over from scratch. Shinji Mikami, who worked as a producer on the game, claimed that it was because the gameplay and locations were apparently dull and boring. This also served as a make-or-break moment for the young game director Hideki Kamiya. Him and Mikami originally clashed over creative decisions, and after the game was started over, Mikami took a more hands-off role in Resident Evil 2's development. And this bold decision, it clearly paid off big time. The game was released in January 1998, and the rest is history. But for a small subset of Resident Evil fans, people still wanted that first version of the game, the version of the game that would become known as Resident Evil 1.5. You see, things were different back then. Things were way less transparent and information was hard to come by. I dug up an old copy of Electronic Gaming Monthly from June 1997, where they broke the news that the game was delayed until 1998. And of course, they were still using screenshots of Resident Evil 1.5. So for a long time, that's what players were expecting. The character on display is a girl named Elza Walker, a biker who would later be reimagined as Claire Redfield. Resident Evil 2 Remake actually included an Elza Walker alternate costume as a nod to Resident Evil 1.5. And there were of course other major changes, including rehauling the police station itself. The original actually had a much more traditional looking police station. It was very gray, very cold looking, especially compared to the version that made it into the final game. Zombies had a lower polygon count, and this was an intentional decision, so a larger number of zombies could actually appear on screen at once. Your character's appearance would change depending on damage taken, side characters played larger roles, Leon was still in the game, but was a bit older and no longer a rookie cop. Internet forums and communities also looked a lot different back then. There was no Reddit, no social media, no central hub for a community to communicate. Instead, conversation about Resident Evil was spread out across multiple sites and message boards. In 1999, one of these sites, a Resident Evil fan site called BioFlames, had acquired over 100 images of 1.5 in action. Apparently, these were acquired from a direct contact over at Capcom in Japan, who had taken the photos with his cell phone. So while they weren't the highest quality pics, they were undeniably legitimate. This, I feel, is what really opened Pandora's box. This is what proved that there was still a playable version of this game in existence. And that's really what fueled the hunt for 1.5. Though the contact in Japan then went completely silent and was never heard from again. Undoubtedly, this person was under an NDA, so there's a good chance he faced some consequences for these actions, which may be why he had to cut contact. Because these photos really lit up the Resident Evil community, and in the following years, fans would continue to chase up any lead on 1.5 and even start online petitions for Capcom to release the game. The community was eventually faced with the realization that the only people who would have access to 1.5 directly are Capcom employees, all of who would be under strict non-disclosure agreements. So it seemed any hope of 1.5 seeing the light of day were completely in Capcom's hands. But a major breakthrough occurred in March of 2005, when a user discovered 1.5 content hidden on a Resident Evil 2 demo disc. Old code that hadn't been removed revealed rooms and assets never before seen. This is now more than 7 years after the release of Resident Evil 2. And after years of compiling screenshots, video footage from old trade shows, the content from the demo disc, some people had even begun laying out maps for what the game would look like. There were initiatives to basically build an unofficial version of 1.5. But the notion that this game was still out there, sitting on an old hard drive or burned to a disk stuffed in a drawer somewhere, it was still very tantalizing. This of course led to countless false leads, scams, and cash grabs of people claiming to have a copy. It soured the community. People were jaded, and it wasn't until 2007, nearly 10 years after Resident Evil 2's release, that the community would be completely turned on its head. In late 2007, an active member of the 1.5 community, .50cal, was contacted regarding an estate sale of an apparently deceased former Capcom employee. That's one way to get out of a contract. The item in question was, of course, a copy of Resident Evil 1.5, a genuine and confirmed prototype. .50cal then turned to some prominent members of the community to raise funds, and were able to put together about $4,000. This was it. A decade-long search was nearly over. Only someone had already bought it. Another buyer swept in and purchased it for a mere $300, which I can only imagine stung, hurt, just a little bit. Though it didn't take long for people to figure out who the buyer was. Just days later, a new post was made on a website called the PlayStation Museum, a site dedicated to archiving PS1 games, and their new addition was, of course, Resident Evil 2 Prototype, aka Resident Evil 1.5. The post contained higher resolution screenshots and details of 1.5 that confirmed this was a legit copy of the game. The person who ran the PlayStation Museum, the person in possession of 1.5, would become known in the community as the Curator. And in what can only be described as schoolyard bully behavior, the Curator went on to taunt and tease the Resident Evil community. I've never seen anything like it. Trolling in the BioFlames forums using dummy accounts, posting a video on YouTube of Resident Evil 1.5 being recorded off-screen, accompanied by hot chocolates, "You sexy thing."
I believe in miracles.
What hurt the most is the Curator, he wasn't even a Resident Evil fan. He had purchased the prototype based solely on the rarity of the item, and attempts at striking a deal with the Curator were futile as he began asking for egregious amounts of money. Despite the fact that the Curator technically did nothing wrong and bought the prototype fair and square, it was hard not to feel like he was almost holding it for ransom and denying the community even a rip of the disc itself, undoubtedly because that would completely devalue his new prized possession. In December of 2007, an eBay listing appeared containing Resident Evil 1.5 with an asking price of $125,000. Members of the BioFlames forums were able to trace the posting back to the Curator. And looking at the eBay seller's history, the account was originally created under the user ID BioFlames with a PH, a clear jab at the BioFlames community.
Guy's a maniac. Why'd he buy me?
To say that the Curator was an unpopular figure in the Resident Evil community at this time would be a gross understatement. And though his actions for sure earned him some criticism, I wouldn't gloss over the fact that some members of the community had become very hostile towards him, even going so far as to issue threats and using scare tactics like tracking down his IP and his location. One user posted that they were going to report him to Capcom, who may take legal action. It's hard to say which exactly was the straw that broke the camel's back, but the Curator had removed all his Resident Evil 1.5 content from both YouTube as well as the PlayStation Museum. And after that, several years of silence followed. Just like that, 1.5 slipped through the community's fingers. In 2011, Resident Evil 5 had been out for a couple of years, and Resident Evil 6 was just around the corner. It was an interesting time for the franchise, starting to struggle to find its identity. But while the obsessive search for 1.5 had more or less faded, for some it was still lingering. There was unfinished business, lack of closure, and in early 2011, the curator had once again emerged online and uploaded more footage of Resident Evil 1.5. A longtime figurehead of the search for 1.5, a user who went by the name Alzair, gathered a handful of longtime members of the 1.5 community to pitch in for one final offer to the curator. Putting all their cards on the table, this was what felt like the last stand, and for a sum of $8,000, the deal was made, and the group had purchased the Resident Evil 1.5 prototype. And this, you'd think, would be the end of the story, but it isn't. Alzair had the copy of 1.5 in his hands by April of 2011. Over a decades-long search, a piece of history. I can't imagine what it must have been like. And this is where it gets complicated. The copy was purchased by a group of about 7 to 8 people who, upon receiving the game and playing it in the state that it was in, they decided not to release it to the public. Now, this could likely be attributed to a number of reasons. Most people would probably jump to greed, though I had mentioned the state that the game was in, and that's because it was barely playable. It wasn't stable, the doors and rooms were connected to each other in nonsensical ways, models weren't finished, it was a mess. Can you imagine searching for a game for over a decade only to discover that it was awful? So ultimately what they ended up doing was putting together a team of modders and people familiar with the PS1 and the game engine to patch the game. They went by the name Team I Got a Shotgun, or Team IGAS. But their intentions really went beyond patching the game, but translating it to English, reworking assets, and even adding in repurposed assets from Resident Evil 2 and custom models. Essentially, their goal was to finish the game. And on top of all of that, they were doing all of this in secrecy. No one else in the 1.5 community were aware that they had even acquired the game, let alone that they were reworking it. But they were only able to keep quiet for so long. It just takes one person to share a copy with a couple friends, some screenshots get posted, people start asking questions. It's hard to keep a group of people silent, especially when they're in possession of something that so many other people desire. And now this definitely split the community and led to a whole lot of infighting in the 1.5 scene. A lot of people were mad at the group for essentially holding out on them, while there were others who did support the project. And for myself, speaking from a pure preservationist perspective, I believe the right thing to do would be to release the game as it was. A patched, reworked version is certainly a fun project, so long as the original, untouched Capcom build is also available. That's just my opinion. But in early February 2013, it seemed someone outside of Team IGAS had gotten hold of one of their builds and had begun shopping it around to potential buyers. If there's one thing that has permeated the entire story of Resident Evil 1.5, it's that it's full of people trying to make a quick buck.
That explains the horrible things I've seen.
In a way, it kind of forced the team's hand. Later that month, Team IGAS put out a statement urging people who may have paid for the build to immediately seek out a refund. It was never the team's intention to sell the game for money, not to mention they'd almost immediately be hit with a cease and desist even if they tried, and also included in their statement a link to download 1.5. It was finally public just over 15 years later, fully playable on emulators and even modded original PS1 hardware. It really was a monumental moment, especially for those who had been involved in the scene since the early days. The version released was the modified one by Team IGAS, and is known as the Magic Zombie Door version, or MZD. However, not long after, the original untouched version was also released. This one is known as the Pure Vanilla build, or PVB. It also goes by the 40% build. Now, it's called the 40% build because the only version to ever enter circulation online, the same one the MZD build is based, was apparently only 40% complete. However, rumor has it that there's an 80% build in existence. So in a way, the search isn't over. I don't think the search will ever be over. And to this day, the MZD build continues to receive patches and updates, even as recent as March 2020, the month that I'm recording this video. And after playing it and the Pure Vanilla build, I'm honestly grateful for the work that was put into the MZD version to restore the game. I think it is the best way to experience it. But more than anything, I think I'm grateful for Resident Evil 2. I'm grateful that the development team made that hard decision to restart from scratch 23 years ago. And while I do absolutely love this obscure slice of gaming history, after playing it, I understand what Shinji Mikami had meant. I don't think this game would have delivered and had the same impact had it come to see the light of day. The decision to restart the game was actually very warranted, and what became of it was a masterpiece. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Deep Cuts. As always, let me know what you thought about it. If you did enjoy it, please hit that like button. It does help me out a lot. And also consider binge watching some of the other Deep Cut videos I've made on this channel. They're very interesting, I think. Thanks so much for watching this one. Peace.